Hello and welcome to Health on the Line from the NHS Confederation, the organisation that represents members from across the health and care sector. I'm sure you'll all have seen last week's announcements concerning 50% cuts to ICB budgets. Alongside news that NHS England will wind down within 2 years and transition its functions into the Department for Health and Social Care. As well as, of course, of the expectation that acute providers roll back 50% of corporate cost growth since 2020. So what we wanted to do on Health on the Line was to talk to people at the front line of this experience. So I've talked to a system leader and to a provider leader to get their views on the subject. First up, Amanda Sullivan, Chief Executive of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire ICB. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Without wanting to be intrusive, I guess the first question is, how was it for you when this kind of bombshell, particularly in relation to ICB funding, when that broke last week?
It did come as quite unexpected, I think, and a shock, I think, for leaders and for the staff in the systems. And I think we could all see a direction of travel, but the speed and the extent of the changes, I think, have taken us really very much by surprise.
And how does it feel right now? I mean, I'm going to talk to you about the implications of all of this and how you're responding, but you're the leader of an organisation whose staff have heard this announcement out of the blue. How are people kind of feeling right now?
Yeah, so people understandably are feeling very uncertain and anxious about their own futures. And my first priority has been to convey to staff what we know and what we don't know, and also to promise that we will keep people as informed as we possibly can as we go through the different phases of this restructure and reorganisation. So it's very much about trying to keep people engaged with the really important work that we need to do at the moment, the 25-26 plans that you mentioned, and keep moving forward on the development of neighbourhood health and dealing with some of the system challenges that we have, whilst recognising that people are, really committed to what they're doing and also anxious about their personal circumstances as we move forward.
Yeah, no, completely understandable. Obviously, we are working with colleagues at NHS England, with Penny Dash, who of course is incoming NHSE chair, but was until very recently the chair of an ICS herself in North West London. We're talking about the implications of all of this. Amanda, what's your first take on this? Because I guess where we come from on it is that it's very easy to interpret this as the beginning of the end for ICBs, coming on top as it is of the 30% cut that you had to undertake in previous financial year. But yet at the same time, we're assured by Jim Mackey and others that ICSs still have a role to play. So when your colleagues ask you, well, what is our future? What's your kind of best account of what the future role is?
I think what I've said to certainly our teams there are some signals there of what is likely to remain. One of them is the development of neighbourhood health teams, and we are already working on that, so we need to keep going and accelerate that. And then the signals around strategic commissioning remaining are there as well. In my own mind, I'm thinking that the scale of the cuts that we had previously, the 30%, I could see a way through to that without anything obvious to the public around what we do. I think the scale of what we are facing now is different because possibly not very well recognised, but a lot of what ICBs do is very much direct support for services. So we are assessing people's care needs, we're arranging mental illness aftercare, we're working with infection outbreaks in communities, in care homes. We are actively involved in safeguarding. It's not form filling or double checking what the providers are doing. It's complex safeguarding decisions with police, local authorities, and quite a lot of things that are perhaps hidden but would be noticeable with the scale of cutbacks. And it's difficult to see how all of that will remain. As I say, that's around 60% of what we do alongside commissioning.
And let's talk a bit more about that notion of strategic commissioning, Amanda. What do you understand by this phrase, strategic commissioning?
So I think it means different things to different people. And I do think in the next period, we need to get to a more shared understanding of that. For me, it's the whole commissioning cycle. And I've worked half my career in an acute provider and half of my career in commissioning organisations. Strategic commissioning to me is, again, a cycle. So it's assessing the health needs of the population and understanding where we need to target effort and energy, doing that partly as an NHS exercise, partly with local authorities, planning services, both on a strategic level, but also how things that come in national must be done, waiting times, etc., making sure that we incorporate those into how we arrange our services. And then the legal term of securing services through contracting, I think in a more strategic approach, that might be more around how we integrate services, how we think longer term about those developments. And then the final part of commissioning is the evaluation. And obviously all throughout that, our engagement with local communities and understanding what it is like to receive services for our population, then that is also important. But also thinking very long term about what can we do to make the best use of the resource for the longer term health outcomes. So it is more of a helicopter view about how the local NHS works, not a sort of day-to-day tactical micromanagement approach.
No, that's really helpful, Amanda, because it kind of takes me to the thing that I've been kind of wrestling with a bit, which is that, if you talk about the strategic commissioning role of ICSs, people say, oh, yes, that's very, very important. But then when you talk about the oversight role of ICSs, then that's much more controversial. People start talking about duplication. There's, suggestions that providers don't really want ICSs to play their role, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess the question I've got is, if you commission a service, presumably you do have to then have some oversight as to whether or not that service is actually being provided. So you can't entirely, can you separate commissioning and oversight?
I completely agree. It is one of the activities within within a strategic commissioning cycle or any commissioning cycle. And I do think there needs to be some clear thinking about where commissioning, evaluation, monitoring of outcomes, monitoring that services are being delivered in the way that they best can be delivered and the models of care are working, where that stops and where perhaps what you might call performance management and regulation starts. And I do think they're interlinked, and the best way of understanding our services is a much more cohesive approach. And I've been reflecting on how I've worked in different commissioning structures and how it's worked at different times. Years ago, I was director of nursing in a primary care trust, which was obviously a very different commissioning regime then and provider regime. And I was held to account for MRSA infection rates in my patch. And you could say, oh, that's right. It's all about antibiotic prescribing in general practice. That was certainly a part of it. There were also some environmental and community factors, and also some hospital practices as well. And the only way of really making inroads was to bring all of those elements together and address that. And I think more recently in the integrated care system approach, which is about joint problem solving, understanding the whole pathways, what's happening in each part of the sector, and having a collective view about that. We have used that in Nottinghamshire to make quite significant inroads into urgent and emergency care discharge. And it's only by a single version of the truth, shared data, a shared view of all of it, can you really distinguish between what is an operational process issue, what is a capacity issue, what are the drivers of demand, are they population, are they supply-led demand, are they about clinical thresholds and behaviours. It's only when you put all of the bits of the jigsaw together, is it part of community service, is it a social care issue, you can be forensic about it, because otherwise my fear is we go back to where we were before, where you have different sectors looking out from different vantage points and saying, oh, it's all to do with primary care, or it's all to do with social care, or it's all those others, if only those others did something different. And that, I think, has been a real change over the last few years that's just really maturing in many systems. And if we lose that again and it becomes partisan, I think we've lost something really valuable in terms of improving health outcomes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Amanda. And, to be honest with you, and I was talking to Sarah Waters, who runs the ICS network the other day. I mean, I think we both feel, on behalf of the Confed, that we failed, really, in the sense that somehow the argument about the role of systems and what systems are doing, it's not been lost, but it's certainly not being won in the centre. We noticed that Jim Mackey has brought in a group of people to his executive team. They're all providers. They're all acute providers. They're nearly all university hospitals. That reflects something that's happened here. And I think what I find most frustrating is that when I go around the country, in most places, and it's not been easy, systems and providers are working pretty effectively with local government. That's not easy either. Where the larger systems are devolving to place as far as possible. But yet somehow it feels that a small number of providers who've never really been happy with this, don't really want anyone to oversee them, have kind of captured the agenda. Now, maybe I'm just feeling kind of miserable about things because of the announcement last week, but there still is this kind of sense, isn't there, that providers and systems are at war, whereas I go around the country, really isn't the case in most places.
I completely agree. And I think in these changes that we make and decisions that get made about form and function, we do need to have an evidence-based, sensible view about what is going to be best for the populations and what makes the best use of the considerable assets, talents and resources that we have in the NHS collectively. Wherever you look, whatever health system you look at, you have commissioning functions in one form or another, whether it's through an insurance-based system or through a publicly funded system. There are functions and perspectives that need to be brought to bear in order to best use resources. And I think if this turns into a turf war instead of a view about how can we use our collective assets, skills, perspectives to the best effect, then I think we have lost something there. Having said that, I can see there are some things that need to be reset. I think there is over-complex arrangements around some things. There are bureaucratic requirements of us, and that is not necessarily always helpful. And I think the deficits culture does need a reset, particularly given the macro environment that we're in. So I can completely see a logic for needing to do something urgently and rapid. I just hope we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, really.
Amanda, it's been really great talking to you, partly because I think it's great for our listeners to hear this, but also because you've helped me understand what you expect from me and the team here at the Confed over the next few weeks and months. Thanks so much for joining us on Health on the Line.
Thank you very much.
And next up, with a provider perspective, here's Foluke Ajayi, the CEO of Airedale NHS FT Trust. And also, we're proud to say, now the Deputy Chair of the NHS Confederation itself. Foluke, welcome to Health on the Line.
Thanks, Matthew. Good to be here.
So Foluke, first, I'm just interested in your reactions to what happened last week, to the amalgamation and then to the news of the cuts.
Well, I think it's fair to say it was rather a shock. I think the direction of travel was probably known, but I think to land the messages as quickly as they did in quick succession with little prep particularly for the colleagues affected, for me was the biggest issue, actually. I also think that there's something about, so what's next, which was not immediately apparent.
Yes, and I felt that a little, Foluke. I think we can talk now because it was a few days ago about the meeting of chief executives of systems and providers and chairs that we had in London. And my feeling at that meeting was, I think I'd sum it up as more questions than answers. It felt like there was a plan, but quite a lot of the plan hasn't really been thought through in terms of implementation. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It felt that we were hearing the direction of travel before there were foamed up plans, and therefore really difficult for leaders to articulate what this meant and what the next steps would be.
And when you look at the financial challenges that you face in terms of your own trust, how is that starting to shape up now in your mind in terms of what the major implications are going to be, what you're going to have to do?
I think it's about how we work, both across the system, but within the organisation with colleagues to help them understand the grave position we're in and how actually we need to think carefully about what must we do and what are the nice to haves and how we bring colleagues along with us in that journey. I think that's part of it. I think there's the balancing act about how do we deliver services and try and clear the backlog as soon as we can while still reducing the spend rate. You could argue that those two things are not always equal, but there's much more work we need to do around productivity. So focus on that and a focus on actually we need to now get rid of the nice to haves because we can't afford it this time.
And in that, Foluke, there's an unhelpful narrative, isn't there, about, systems and providers being hostile to each other, not able to work together. It used to upset me really. I used to go, when I spoke to NHS England, they always used to kind of say, because systems and providers, they don't like each other at all. And I always think, well, this is a way in NHS England justifying its existence because this had to be the parent because the children are arguing. But actually, when I went around the country and I spoke to systems and providers, yes, it varied from place to place. And yes, there were always tensions, but I was seeing some really great work, particularly around integration and particularly around trying to start the process of the leftward shift. What's your, as a provider leader, Foluke, what's your take on that?
So I'd agree with you, Matthew. I think there are tensions, and I think tension is healthy because it pushes you to really think of the art of the possible and to challenge your thinking. But ultimately, providers and systems are committed to working together for the benefit of their local population. And that's what we are trying to do. Sometimes it takes a while to get there, and that might be the frustration that NHS England is expressing. But sometimes you do need that time to really think through the best approaches to get you to where you need to. And indeed, only yesterday I was talking to partners in my system about the difficult choices we need to make and being careful about the implications for each other's statutory organisations, but also the ramifications for the wider system. All of this needs thinking through. If I make a decision that affects my partners, actually that could be counterproductive. So we need to work through together on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Flick. And in fact, just before this conversation, I was speaking to some folks at the centre of the 10-year plan process and in the department. And I was saying to them that the thing you have to have an answer to is this. All of us, and I'm a chief executive, all chief executives will have a tendency to put their organisation first. It's natural. These are the people you work with day in, day out. And if something goes wrong in your organisation, you're going to get the flack as a chief executive. But yet the health service cannot work, and we certainly can't have the preventative shift or the leftward shift if people only care about their organisations and aren't willing sometimes to say, well, I've actually got to sacrifice my organisation's interests if we're going to make the whole place or the system work. And my point was somebody's got to do that you have to have some muscle behind that, because otherwise, and it's not because people are bad, people will just retreat to being defensive about their organisation. And that retreat becomes even worse when there's no money because the risks feel greater. Do you think that's true, Fluke?
Yeah, I think so. I think that definitely was the immediate feeling, I suppose, not even last week, as we approached planning this year and it became clear what we were up against. Actually, there was an active decision that said we must avoid retreating into our organisations because we could feel ourselves that was what was about to happen. And the importance of holding together strongly. And your point about if that means I need to sacrifice, the system must rally around the organisation that is doing the sacrifice. So we mustn't forget the decisions we made and the risks we agreed to hold or accept for the greater good. And I think that's the bit that really matters, because the danger is we will retreat, and actually all the work we're trying to do around moving services into community, around prevention, we just will never really get there.
Yes, and related to that, Flick, is that the other thing I couldn't help noticing about that gathering of chief executives in London last week was that apart from Amanda in her kind of valedictory speech at the beginning, I don't think the word primary was used once. And it was a session that included a presentation about the UEC pathway. So what worries me slightly is that when I go around the country, Flick, I would say the biggest thing that drives variation in the success of integration, system working and place working, is whether primary is able to work at scale, at place. That is the single biggest variable. And I worry, again, that something that's a bit missing at the moment is an account of how it is we fully engage primary. Now, I've been to places like East Birmingham where it's happening really well and it's exciting, but that primary engagement issue is critical, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's critical. If we are going to move towards neighbourhood health, we need to have our primary care colleagues around the table with us to help shape what that looks like. And it's really important that they are able to give a perspective about the service delivery options and how it might work and how we all wrap around the citizens in a way that makes sense. Myself as an acute and community provider, I could say what I think it looks like, but I'm not walking in their shoes. So it's imperative that every member of the system is part of those conversations. And I think you're right. They're often neglected in a way. And even I would say that session last week limited conversations about community and mental health as well. And that is something that we really need to pay close attention to in terms of the work we're doing.
Yeah, no, and when I talk to people at the centre, it's interesting. There's a kind of recognition that it looks from the outside like we're moving to a world where the acute sector is supposed to kind of lead all the change in the service, but they want to reassure me that isn't their view. That isn't how they think the future needs to be. But there's a bit of a kind of credibility gap. The other group that I worry about is local government in all of this, because of course part of the idea behind ICS working was more collaboration with local government. That's at the heart of place working as well. You know, you're someone deeply committed to your local community, involved in your local community. It is important, isn't it, that we keep our local government colleagues in the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely required that we do that. I think that's where a focus on the place, a focus on what we're doing together, regardless of what's happening around us, is going to be really important and continues to be important. How do we share our own intelligence and how do we design what we believe this means for us? I think at this point, with all of the changes that are going on, I dare say that the challenge of the system above us, NHS England, ICBs trying to reorientate themselves, will be a distraction. It doesn't matter what we say. So how do we hold tight locally to focus on what's really important?
Thanks for that point, Foluke, because I think that one of the things I'm giving a lot of time to at the moment is how do you, as a leader, keep people focused, keep people feeling hopeful when they're worried about their status. I mean, all the research, I've looked at a lot of research this week, the research is pretty universally says that it's very difficult to keep an organisation focused on its core task, let alone kind of doing things differently when people within that organisation are worried about their jobs. So how ICSs, how NHS England preside over recovery and reform when up to half the people there are worried about losing their jobs. What would be your advice as a leader about how to do that?
So I think we go back to where we started, clarity about what happens next. I think, if we were clear today about the function of ICBs, for example, and how we expect the new NHS England stroke into DHSC is going to work, that immediately enables us to start to understand what the form is and brings clarity to colleagues. So I would say that's a priority. I think the other thing we need to do is recognise the challenge and the environment that colleagues are working in, the stress that they're under, and help them, whilst they are navigating that, have purpose to keep them focused. Because if we don't help focus their minds on the important work that they can do today, it will be even harder. And I think the final piece is we mustn't shy away in terms of supporting them with career advice. Whether we like it or not, people are going to jump. And actually, I would say it's better to support those people because we can't offer false promise. And there is work to do today. But if somebody says, actually, this is an opportunity I want to pursue, we should be supporting them.
Yes, thank you. And I think the only thing I'd add to that, Fluke, is that in terms of the service as a whole, we need to just keep reminding ourselves we're all in this together and we have to find solutions that work for everyone. We're bringing together next week people from across the service to think about the best way of taking forward the operating model. So, we'll have acute, mental health, community, primary leaders there. we have to work together. The NHS is at its least impressive when the different bits of the NHS think that the way to look after themselves is to kind of attack the other bits of the NHS. And I think we at the Confed, and it's so great that you're now on our board as our deputy chair, I think we in the Confed, that's the thing we feel is a deep ethical thing for us, is to keep the system together, keep the service together in these hard times.
Yeah, completely agree. We're better together, and therefore we need to hold together.
Foluke, thank you so much for joining me on Health on the Line.
Thanks, Mehdi.
So, thanks to Foluke and Amanda for their insights as we work through these, well, it's an understatement to say, challenging times. That just leaves me to introduce our latest Leader in 6 interview. Taking the reins this time is our chair, Lord Victor Adebowale. Victor recently met Basirat Sadiq, CEO of Homerton Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust. As you will hear, they got on like a house on fire. But in Victor's visit to Hackney, where Baz is also place-based leader, they did find time for Victor to ask the 6 questions.
Baz, very nice to meet you. You've had a really good chat. Very impressed with your vision, how you're doing things. Got some questions to ask you. Right now, what's the most pressing thing that's on your desk?
Gosh, I'm going to be so boring and talk a little bit about the most pressing thing being what every chief exec's thinking at the moment, which is obviously the financial challenge.
Yeah.
But what I want to do is bring it into what it means for us in place, given that's the conversation we've been having.
Yeah.
We've just talked about how much for the place of City and Hackney, I and the team and the people that work here fundamentally believe in this, the 3 shifts. So the reason why the finance is probably my biggest challenge at the moment is how we do that without making decisions that stop us from being able to achieve that in the longer term. So how do we protect what we've already doing in City and Hackney? We have spent years investing in that community infrastructure. We describe it as the ecosystem of City and Hackney, that great relationship between primary care, community services, local authority, voluntary sector. We've invested a lot.
Well, I've seen it at work, and it's really powerful. And any disinvestment actually really does impact on outcomes, and we can't afford to do it. I don't know whether Wes listens to this podcast, but if you are listening, Wes, you need to come here. It's not for me to tell you what.
Yes, come.
I'm just a mere mortal, but you need to see this stuff. What area of improvement or innovation that's going on right now would you be most keen for everyone to know about?
So I think the one that I'm most excited about is the work that we are doing on neighbourhoods, particularly around the integrated neighbourhoods team. The City and Hackney have had a history of probably the last kind of 8-10 years, I want to say, of building this structure and investing in neighbourhoods team. And we are just at the point of moving on to the next evolution of that model, really making it BAU, embedding it in the way that we deliver all of our health and hospital care. So moving it, transition it from this kind of program management approach that we've had for the last couple of years into this is the way
we do things around it. And the end result of that, because I was talking to one of your colleagues earlier, and I was trying to say to people, just getting into really plain language. So what could a punter in this, Hackney and City expect? And what they can expect is not to have to tell the story more than once. It's positive value transfer, which will save them time, money, and health.
Absolutely.
And it's just a fantastic innovation. I agree. And it's scalable. Like, everybody should be doing this.
And I think it allows us to remove, we've talked about it before, we've seen evidence of removing duplication. People aren't telling their stories multiple times. And actually, if you can really care for people at that kind of neighbourhood footprint model, you're doing the prevention agenda at the same time. So I think real opportunity. I'm just excited by it.
Well, it's prevention. It's the first. Well, it's not in first steps. It's the left shift in action, and I think it's very impressive. Now I've got to ask you about yourself. Tell us something about yourself that's interesting.
Well, I found out recently. I was speaking to my sister. I have the same birthday as Adele.
Really?
Yeah, and she's a Tottenham girl. Like, give me a bit of that, that success, Adele. I mean, she was born in Tottenham. I was born in Nigeria, but we both grew up in Tottenham.
That's true.
Tottenham girls.
True.
And then, went down the rabbit hole of who else was born on the 5th, and then I realised I've got the same birthday as Carl Max as well. So
I was thinking one of those people appeared in Las Vegas. If you were the NHS King Queen for the day, what is the one reform you would introduce?
I don't know if we need more reforms. I think we've got enough, if I'm honest.
Do you? I agree with you in the sense that people get used to episodic change. Yeah. And there's a danger that they get used to keeping it go rather than doing them. I've got 2 more questions. Right? Who is the health service or other leader you most admire and why?
So most people know I'm Christian, very active in my local church, and I'm going to pick probably my local pastor.
Oh.
And the reason for that is I've learned so much from him. So probably a couple of years ago, he and his wife, and I still look and go, how the hell did you do that? Anyway, they left the UK, to go and preach the gospel and start a whole new kind of movement, gospel movement in Queenstown, South Africa. They had a young baby at the time.
I've been there.
It was at a time when, apartheid still quite new. It's where I learned how do you do stuff that makes you feel uncomfortable, but you believe would benefit the majority. So I take a bit of that from them and try. I don't always model it, but I try and say, how do I be less selfish? Yeah. How do I do things that might make me uncomfortable, but are
the right thing?
The right thing to do. So I'm going to say yes.
And last question, you got to recommend a film, TV series or podcast.
Right, okay, I'm really going to be sharing something from myself here. Oh God, I can't believe it. I am a big Marvels fan.
You're not?
I am obsessed.
I think me too.
I have seen every Marvel film at least 3 or 4 times. Call it Captain America. So any one of them, I think, watch the whole lot.
You and my daughter. She's an absolute expert on the Marvel Universe. She can tell you which timeline, which universe.
Yeah.
Okay, little tip for you. Yeah. There's a new Daredevil.
Oh, yeah. It's on my watch list.
And it's damn good. It's damn good.
Go watch it.
Thank you very much. It's been really good to talk to you, actually. Really good.
You've been listening to Health on the Line from the NHS Confederation. Visit nhsconfed.org for more information about us and to register for events and webinars that delve deeper into the issues explored in this podcast.